Brussels, December 1943. A Gestapo officer crosses the Rue de la Loi just after curfew. The fog is thick, the streets empty except for distant patrol boots on cobblestone. He never hears the shot. There is no muzzle flash, no crack echoing between the buildings. One moment he is lighting a cigarette, the next he is collapsing against the iron fence of Parc de Bruxelles, the cigarette still burning as it falls from his lips. His killer is already turning the corner, a bent piece of pipe sliding back inside a worn overcoat. By the time the body is discovered 20 minutes later, the weapon that killed him has been disassembled and hidden in 3 separate locations across the city. Between October 1943 and February 1944, more than 40 German officers and collaborators died this way in occupied Belgium. Silent deaths. No witnesses. No shell casings. No evidence except small puncture wounds that puzzled German pathologists. The Gestapo called it the ghost murders. The resistance called it justice. And at the center of it all was a 34-year-old plumber named Henri Dubois, whose artisan's pride in his work would eventually become the signature that betrayed an entire network. Henri had been a plumber for 16 years when the Germans occupied Brussels in May 1940. He was good at his trade, known in the Morales district for careful work and fair prices. He fixed radiators in the winter, repaired burst pipes in basements, installed heating systems in the townhouses near the Grand Place. His hands were always stained with grease and solder residue. His fingernails carried permanent crescents of black that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Before the war, this was simply the mark of honest labor. After May 1940, it became the mark of something else entirely. The occupation changed Brussels slowly, then all at once. First came the regulations. Jews had to register. Radios had to be surrendered. Curfew at 9 p.m., then 8, then 7 as winter came. Then came the disappearances. Henri's younger brother, Thomas, was arrested in March 1943 for distributing underground newspapers. He was 26 years old, a schoolteacher who believed words could fight tanks. The Gestapo held him for 11 days at their headquarters on Avenue Louise before executing him at the Tir National Shooting Range. They did not return the body. They did not confirm the death officially for 3 weeks. When the notice finally came, it was a single typewritten line. Thomas Dubois, executed for crimes against the Reich. No trial. No appeal. No grave to visit. Henri did not cry at first. He went to his workshop in the basement of his apartment building on Rue Haute and worked through the night, replacing the corroded pipes in a heating system that had not functioned properly in months. He soldered joints with hands that did not shake. He threaded fittings with the same precision he had always maintained. It was only when he finished at dawn, when he turned off his torch and set down his tools, that he realized he had been working on a heating system for a building that had been abandoned since the bombing raids of 1940. He had been fixing pipes that led nowhere for people who would never return. That morning he was contacted by a man named Marcel. Marcel was 41, a former sergeant in the Belgian army who had escaped the surrender at Dunkirk and made his way back to Brussels through occupied France. He walked with a slight limp from shrapnel that had never been properly removed, and he smoked incessantly, even though tobacco was rationed and expensive. Marcel represented a cell of the resistance that specialized in what he called executive actions. The terminology was borrowed from the British SOE, who supplied the Belgian underground with weapons, explosives and radio equipment through airdrops in the countryside. But SOE's weapons were designed for different work. Sten guns were loud. Grenades were indiscriminate. What Marcel needed was something that could kill silently, reliably, at close range in the middle of a city where every gunshot brought patrols within minutes. He needed something that looked like nothing at all. Marcel came to Henri's workshop on a Tuesday in early October. He brought a package wrapped in oiled canvas. Inside were 3 items. A British Welrod pistol, disassembled. A technical drawing, hand-copied and translated into French. And a challenge. The Welrod was effective, Marcel explained, but also rare. SOE could not supply enough for the operations being planned. What Marcel needed was a local solution. Something that could be manufactured in Brussels using materials that would not draw attention. Something that could be assembled by resistance fighters without specialized training. Something that could be fired once, then disassembled and scattered before the body was even cold. Henri studied the Welrod for 3 days. He did not sleep much. He measured every component, sketched every angle, calculated tolerances and pressures. The Welrod was elegant in its simplicity. A bolt-action mechanism to eliminate the noise of a cycling slide. A suppressor built into the frame itself, using baffles to slow and cool the propellant gases before they escaped. Subsonic 9mm ammunition to avoid the sonic crack of a bullet breaking the sound barrier. The entire weapon was designed around a single principle. Silence is survival. But the Welrod required machining tools that Henri did not have, materials that would trigger immediate suspicion if purchased in occupied Brussels. So Henri simplified. He stripped the concept down to its essential components and rebuilt it using what a plumber could access without drawing Gestapo attention. Industrial pipe sections readily available and utterly mundane. Steel rod stock for the bolt. Springs salvaged from damaged machinery. The ammunition remained 9mm, the same caliber used by the German Luger and the Belgian FN Browning, meaning spent casings would not immediately identify a unique weapon. The suppressor was the critical innovation. Henri could not replicate the Welrod's precision machine baffles, but he understood fluid dynamics in a way that came from years of managing water pressure in heating systems. He created a series of expansion chambers using nested pipe sections, each slightly larger than the last, with carefully drilled vents that allowed gases to bleed off gradually. The effect was crude compared to British engineering but effective enough. In testing, firing into sandbags in his basement at 3 a.m. with a towel draped over the muzzle, the sound was comparable to a heavy book dropping on a wooden floor. Loud enough to hear in the same room, quiet enough to disappear into the ambient noise of a city under occupation. The weapon he created looked exactly like what it was. A bent piece of industrial pipe, roughly 14 inches long, with a simple bolt mechanism at the rear and a curved metal trigger underneath. There was no grip in the conventional sense, just the pipe itself wrapped in friction tape for purchase. There were no sights because the weapon was never intended to be fired at more than 10 feet. At that range you simply pointed and squeezed. The bent angle of the pipe, roughly 30 degrees, allowed the weapon to be concealed inside a coat sleeve or against a forearm. When gripped naturally, the bend positioned the barrel forward, aligned with the shooter's line of sight. It was ugly, brutal, and completely functional. Henri finished the first prototype on October 19, 1943. He test-fired it in his basement that night, aiming at a sandbag backstop he had constructed behind a false wall. The sound was a dull thump, absorbed almost entirely by the suppressor and the surrounding stone. He waited 15 minutes, listening for footsteps above, for doors opening, for any sign that someone had heard. Nothing. The building slept. Brussels slept. And somewhere in the darkness, Henri knew, the war had just changed in a way that no one would see coming. He marked the weapon with a small letter H, stamped into the metal near the breech with a punch he used for identifying pipe fittings and complex installations. It was habit, nothing more. The mark of a craftsman who took pride in his work, even when that work was an instrument of death. He would come to regret that habit, but not for 3 more months. If you are still with us, a quick subscribe means everything. Now, let us talk about how Henri's pipe became a weapon of the resistance. Marcel collected the first prototype on October 21st. He said nothing at first, just hefted the weapon, worked the bolt, sighted down the barrel at an imaginary target across the workshop. Then he smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes, and said one word. Good. He returned 5 days later with an order for 12 more. Then 20. Then 15 more after that. By mid-November, Henri was producing 3 weapons per week, working through the nights in his basement while maintaining his cover as a plumber during the day. He still took repair jobs, still walked through the streets with his toolbox, still nodded politely to German soldiers at checkpoints. The toolbox was useful. It carried his legitimate tools on top. Underneath, wrapped in rags and hidden in false compartments, it carried components for the weapons he was building in secret. The resistance distributed the bent pipes carefully. Each weapon went to an experienced operative, someone who understood that the gun was single-shot by design, that reloading required manually working the bolt, that a missed shot meant almost certain death. The weapon was meant for specific work. Close-range executions. Targets who had been identified, followed, studied until their patterns were known. German officers who traveled the same route each night. Collaborators who frequented the same cafes. Gestapo informants who believed their betrayals would be rewarded with protection. The first confirmed kill came on November 8, 1943. The target was a Belgian police inspector named De Vries who had been passing resistance safe house locations to the Germans. He was shot once in the back of the head as he walked through the covered arcade of the Galeries Royales St. Hubert at 8:15 p.m., 15 minutes after curfew, when the arcade was empty except for shadows and distant echoes. The shooter, a woman named Claire who worked as a nurse at St. Pierre Hospital, walked away without running, the weapon already disassembled and distributed in her coat pockets. De Vries was not found until morning. By then, Claire had melted back into the city, and the weapon that killed him had been hidden in 3 separate locations, each part buried in a different basement across Brussels. The operations continued. A Gestapo sergeant who specialized in interrogating captured resistance members died in an alley behind the Ancienne Belgique theater. A German major who had ordered reprisal shootings of Belgian civilians died in his mistress's apartment, the shot timed to coincide with the air raid sirens that wailed every night at 11. A collaborator journalist who published propaganda in Le Soir was killed in the bathroom of a restaurant on Place du Grand Sablon, his body discovered only when other patrons complained about the locked door. Each death was silent. Each death was precise. And each death pushed the Gestapo closer to panic. The Germans understood insurgency. They had experience fighting partisans in Poland, in Yugoslavia, in the Soviet Union. But those were battles fought with rifles and grenades, with explosions that could be heard, with witnesses who could be interrogated. This was different. This was invisible. Officers were dying in the heart of occupied Brussels, surrounded by patrols and checkpoints, and no one heard anything. No one saw anything. The absence of evidence became evidence itself, proof that something new was operating in the shadows. Hauptsturmführer Klaus Richter of the Gestapo was assigned to investigate in late November. He was 38, a lawyer from Hamburg before the war, methodical and intelligent in ways that made him dangerous. Richter did not believe in ghosts. He believed in patterns, in evidence, in the careful accumulation of details that eventually revealed the truth. He began by examining the bodies. Most showed single gunshot wounds, small caliber, close range. The bullets were 9 millimeters, common enough that they revealed nothing. But the wounds themselves were unusual. Minimal exit trauma. Relatively low velocity. The pathologists noted that the bullets had fragmented less than expected, suggesting subsonic ammunition. That was the first clue. The second clue came from a failed operation in early December. A resistance fighter named Anton had attempted to kill a German captain in the lobby of the Hotel Metropole. The captain survived, wounded but conscious enough to describe what happened. He had heard a sound like a cough, felt impact, then saw Anton running. Security forces had shot Anton before he reached the street. When they searched his body, they found the weapon. A bent piece of pipe, crude but functional, still warm from being fired. Richter personally examined the weapon. He noted the bolt action mechanism, the integrated suppressor, the rough construction. And he noted something else. A small mark stamped into the metal near the breech. The letter H, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Richter photographed the mark. He had the weapon disassembled and analyzed. And then he began checking records. Metal workers, machinists, gunsmiths, anyone with the skills to manufacture such a device. The list was long and most leads went nowhere. But Richter was patient. He understood that investigations were built on accumulation, not revelation. Meanwhile, Henri continued working. He had produced 47 weapons by Christmas 1943. Marcel told him the operations were succeeding beyond expectations. German officers were requesting transfers out of Brussels. Collaborators were reconsidering their allegiances. The resistance was winning a psychological war, one silent death at a time. But Henri was growing nervous. The increased Gestapo activity was obvious. Checkpoints were more thorough. Workshops were being searched. 3 metal workers had been arrested in early December, interrogated, released only after their families posted bonds guaranteeing their loyalty. Claire visited Henri's workshop on December 29. She was 28, dark-haired, with steady hands from years of surgical nursing. She and Henri had become close during the months of operations, sharing the weight of what they were doing in ways that words could not quite capture. She warned him that Richter was focusing on craftsmen, that the Gestapo was closing in. She suggested he stop production, at least temporarily, until the attention shifted elsewhere. Henri refused. Marcel had requested 15 more weapons for a major operation planned for late January. A coordinated strike against multiple targets, designed to create maximum disruption. Henri could not stop now. Not when they were so close to making a real difference. Claire asked him to reconsider. Henri showed her the mark he had been stamping on each weapon. The letter H, his signature, his pride. She stared at it for a long moment, then asked why he was marking the weapons at all. Henri did not have a good answer. It was habit, he said. The mark of a craftsman. She told him that craftsmen signed furniture and ironwork, not murder weapons. She told him the mark could identify him, could connect all the weapons to a single source, could unravel everything they had built. Henri said he would stop marking new weapons. But the 47 he had already made, the ones already distributed across the resistance network, those marks could not be erased. Richter found the pattern in mid-January. 3 more weapons had been recovered from captured resistance members, each showing the same small H stamp. That meant a single manufacturer, a single workshop somewhere in Brussels. Richter cross-referenced his list of craftsmen with the locations where weapons had been recovered, looking for geographic patterns. Most of the kills had occurred in a rough triangle bounded by the Morales district, the city center, and the neighborhoods near the Gare du Midi. That suggested someone working in or near the Morales, someone embedded in the working-class neighborhoods where the resistance had deepest roots. Richter ordered raids on every metalworking shop and plumbing business in the target area. The raids began on January 18, 1944. German soldiers accompanied by Gestapo inspectors, searching for welding equipment, pipe stock, anything that could be used to manufacture weapons. Most shops were clean. The owners had nothing to hide beyond Henri's workshop was raided on January 23. He had been expecting it, had spent the previous week hiding everything he could. The completed weapons were already distributed. The components were buried in the basement beneath a false floor covered with coal dust and debris. His tools were arranged to look like nothing more than a plumber's ordinary equipment. When the soldiers arrived at 9 a.m., Henri was working on a legitimate repair job, replacing corroded fittings on a radiator in the building's ground floor apartment. He greeted them politely, showed them his papers, explained that he was simply a plumber trying to make a living during difficult times. CK market tobacco or illegal radios. But Richter was looking for something specific. A workshop with the right tools, the right materials, and the wrong answers when questioned. Henri's workshop was raided on January 23. He had been expecting it, had spent the previous week hiding everything he could. The completed weapons were already distributed. The components were buried in the basement beneath a false floor covered with coal dust and debris. His tools were arranged to look like nothing more than a plumber's ordinary equipment. When the soldiers arrived at 9 a.m., Henri was working on a legitimate repair job, replacing corroded fittings on a radiator in the building's ground floor apartment. He greeted them politely, showed them his papers, explained that he was simply a plumber trying to make a living during difficult times. The soldiers searched anyway. They went through his apartment, his workshop, even the coal cellar. Richter himself was present, walking slowly through the basement, studying the walls, the floor, the tools arranged on the workbench. He picked up a pipe wrench, examined it, set it down. He opened drawers, sifted through fittings and washers and scraps of copper tubing. Henri stood watching, forcing himself to breathe normally, to maintain the expression of mild confusion appropriate for an innocent man subjected to unwarranted search. Richter asked questions. How long had Henri been a plumber? Where did he source his materials? Had he ever done work for the German administration? Henri answered truthfully when he could, carefully when he could not. Richter paused at the workbench. He ran his finger along the edge, examining the residue. Solder flux. Metal filings. The ordinary debris of a working trade. He picked up a small steel punch, the kind used for marking pipe fittings. He studied it for a moment, then looked at Henri. Do you mark your work? He asked. Henri said yes, sometimes for complex installations where multiple pipes needed to be tracked. Richter nodded. He pocketed the punch. Then he turned and walked upstairs without another word. The soldiers left. The building fell silent. Henri waited 10 minutes, then locked his workshop and climbed the stairs to his apartment. His hands were shaking now, the delayed reaction of fear finally catching up. He had been careful. He had hidden everything. But Richter had taken the punch, the same punch Henri had used to mark 47 weapons now scattered across Brussels. If Richter compared that punch to the marks on recovered weapons, if he ran metallurgical analysis on the impressions, the connection would be undeniable. Henri knew he was compromised. The only question was timing. How long before Richter made the connection? How long before they came back with arrest warrants instead of search authorization? He contacted Marcel through the usual channels, a coded message left at a tobacconist on Rue du Midi. They met that night in the basement of a safe house near the canal, a damp space that smelled of mildew and river water. Henri explained the situation. The search. The confiscated punch. The timeline they were now racing against. Marcel listened without interrupting, smoking one cigarette after another, the ember glowing in the darkness. When Henri finished, Marcel asked one question. Can you make the 15 weapons for the January operation? Henri said yes if he had 3 days. Marcel said they had 2. Henri worked through the nights of January 24th and 25th, sleeping in brief intervals between assembly stages, eating little, drinking coffee that Claire brought from the hospital. The weapons took shape on his workbench, one after another, bent pipes that would become instruments of execution. He did not mark these. The letter H, his signature, his pride, remained absent from the final 15. It was too late to matter. The earlier weapons had already sealed his fate. But he could at least deny Richter the satisfaction of seeing the mark on every single piece. The weapons were completed on the morning of January 26th. Marcel arranged for pickup that evening at an abandoned warehouse near the Gare du Midi, a building that had once stored furniture before the war and now stood empty, its windows broken, its floors covered in debris and pigeon droppings. The meeting was scheduled for 8 p.m. after curfew, when the streets would be empty and patrols predictable. Henri would bring the weapons. Marcel and Claire would take delivery. Then Henri would disappear, either fleeing to France through resistance networks or hiding in Brussels until the liberation that everyone hoped was coming but no one could predict. Richter had been waiting for this moment. The metallurgical analysis of the confiscated punch had confirmed the match. The mark on recovered weapons was identical to impressions made by Henri Dubois's tools. More importantly, Richter had done something Henri had not anticipated. He had placed an informant inside the resistance cell. A Belgian collaborator named Victor, who had been feeding information to the Gestapo for 3 months while pretending to be a loyal member of Marcel's network. Victor knew about the warehouse meeting. He knew the timing. And he had reported everything. The night of January 26th was cold, the temperature well below freezing, the streets glazed with ice that reflected the dim streetlights in fractured patterns. Henri walked alone through the murals, his coat buttoned tight, a canvas rucksack on his back containing the 15 weapons wrapped in cloth to prevent metal-on-metal noise. He moved carefully, avoiding main streets, timing his movements to the predictable rotation of German patrols. The warehouse was 15 minutes away on foot. He had walked this route twice during the day, memorizing doorways and alleys and escape routes in case something went wrong. Everything went wrong. Marcel and Claire arrived at the warehouse first, entering through a side door that Victor had assured them would be unlocked. The interior was dark, illuminated only by moonlight filtering through broken windows high on the walls. The space was vast, empty except for scattered debris and the skeletal remains of storage racks. They waited in the darkness, listening to the silence, the distant sounds of the city barely audible through thick brick walls. Henri arrived at 8:10, delayed by a patrol that had deviated from its usual route. He entered through the same side door, his eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness. He saw Marcel and Claire waiting near the center of the space. He moved toward them, already shrugging off the rucksack to make the transfer quick. The lights came on all at once, floodlights positioned in the corners, blazing white and blinding. German commands in harsh voices. Soldiers emerging from concealment behind the storage racks, rifles raised. Gestapo officers in long coats stepping forward. And in the center of it all, Hauptsturmführer Klaus Richter, holding a recovered bent pipe weapon in one hand, studying Henri with the expression of a man who has finally solved a difficult puzzle. Marcel reacted first. He drew a pistol, a real one, a Browning high power that had been airdropped by SOE 3 months earlier. He fired twice, dropping a soldier near the door, creating the chaos necessary for Claire to run. She was fast, sprinting toward the loading dock at the rear of the warehouse, zigzagging between the storage racks while bullets sparked off metal and concrete around her. She made it through the door, disappearing into the night. Marcel fired 3 more times, providing cover, buying seconds that might mean the difference between escape and execution. Then his magazine was empty and there was nowhere left to go. Henri had not moved. The rucksack was still on the ground at his feet. The 15 weapons were still wrapped inside, and used, the entire operation unraveled before it could begin. Richter walked toward him slowly, deliberately, the recovered weapon still in his hand. He held it up so Henri could see the mark stamped near the breech. The letter H, small and precise, exactly matching the punch that had been confiscated 3 days earlier. "You are very skilled," Richter said in French, his accent heavy but intelligible. "A true craftsman. It is unfortunate that you chose the wrong side." Henri said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had known this moment would come, had accepted it the first time he fired a completed weapon in his basement and understood what he was creating. He had simply hoped for more time. More weapons. More dead Gestapo officers. More Germans looking over their shoulders in occupied Brussels. But time had run out, and hope was a luxury neither side could afford anymore. Marcel was executed at the Tir National on January 28th, along with 7 other resistance members whose names Richter extracted through interrogation. Henri was held at the Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Louise, Questioned repeatedly about the network, the contacts, the distribution channels. He said nothing. They did not torture him. Richter seemed to understand that Henri would not break, that some men reach a point where additional pain means nothing because they have already lost everything that mattered. On February 3, 1944, Henri Dubois was transferred to Breendonk Fortress, 20 kilometers south of Brussels, where political prisoners were held before execution or deportation. He was shot on February 11, along with 12 others, in the courtyard where hundreds of Belgians had already died for the crime of resisting occupation. Claire survived. She continued operating with what remained of the resistance network, using one of Henri's final unmarked weapons in 3 more operations before the liberation of Brussels on September 3, 1944. She lived until 1989, never speaking publicly about the war, dying in the same apartment where she had lived since 1938. Among her possessions discovered by her niece during estate clearing, was a small piece of bent pipe, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, with a letter H stamped near the breech. The bent pipe weapons continued to be used sporadically until liberation, though never again in the coordinated manner Henri and Marcel had planned. Richter's raids had disrupted the network too severely for large-scale operations. But individual resistance fighters kept their weapons, using them when opportunity presented itself, when a German officer walked alone through a dark street, when a collaborator grew careless and predictable. The Gestapo never determined exactly how many weapons Henri had produced. The official estimate, based on recovered examples and interrogation records, was 47. The actual number may have been higher. Some weapons were never recovered, hidden by resistance members who took their secrets to the grave or kept them as mementos of a war they preferred to forget. Post-war analysis by British intelligence indicated that Henri's bent pipe design was remarkably similar in principle to the Welrod pistol that had inspired it, though inferior in manufacturing precision and durability. The British judged it crude but effective, a testament to improvisation under impossible circumstances. No formal documentation of Henri Dubois's work exists in SOE records. He was not an agent. He received no training, no official recognition, no medal for service. He was simply a plumber who turned his skills toward resistance when his brother was murdered and his country was occupied. The psychological impact of the bent pipe killings on German forces in Brussels was documented in occupation reports that survived the war. Officers requested transfers with increasing frequency. Security protocols were tightened to the point of paranoia. The Gestapo diverted resources from anti-resistance operations to personal protection details. And in the dark spaces between official reports, in the letters soldiers wrote home and the diary entries they never intended for historical record, there was fear. Fear of the silence. Fear of the invisible. Fear that death could come without warning, without sound, delivered by a piece of bent pipe that looked like nothing more than industrial scrap. Henri Dubois died at 34 years old, unmarried, childless, with no grave marker and no funeral. His name appears on a memorial wall at Breendonk Fortress, one entry among hundreds, easily missed unless you know to look for it. The letter H, stamped into 47 weapons that killed more than 40 German officers and collaborators, became a ghost signature in the historical record, mentioned briefly in post-war resistance histories, footnoted in academic studies of SOE operations, forgotten by everyone except specialists in covert warfare and the few remaining survivors who remembered what it meant to fight in the shadows. That mark, that small act of pride from a craftsman who could not help but sign his work, was both Henri's legacy and his downfall. It connected every weapon to a single source, gave Richter the thread he needed to unravel the network, sealed the fate of the man who believed that even in making instruments of death, there was room for the dignity of craftsmanship. It was a fatal mistake. It was also profoundly human. And in the end, that may be the most important thing to remember about Henri Dubois. Not that he was a hero, though he was. Not that he was skilled, though his weapons proved devastatingly effective. But that he was human, subject to the same flaws and pride and need for meaning that define all of us, even when the stakes are life and death and the difference between resistance and surrender. The bent pipe killed quietly. But its story speaks loudly about what people will risk, what they will create, and what they will sacrifice when the only alternative is accepting occupation without resistance. Tell us what moved you most about Henri's story in the comments below, and subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter of Hidden History. Because there are more stories like this. More weapons that changed wars. More people who risked everything to fight back. And we will bring them to you one quiet death at a time.